Notes for 5-4A, we're going to be factoring polynomials. The first video is just going to concentrate on greatest common factor. Alright, we are going to factor out what is common in polynomials. The current problem, negative 12x squared minus 6x, is a binomial. And we're looking for something to divide out or factor out in this binomial. And I'd like you to separate the two binomials into monomials, as you can see I did here. And we just go to each one and we compare. We notice that we have negative 12 and negative 6. And you ask yourself, what can I divide negative 12 and negative 6 by? And it has to be the greatest or the largest number. And if you remember your times tables, that would be 6. So 6 is what we can divide out of both of them. And we also have to recognize the fact that they're both negative. Then we go to the next term in our monomial, which is the x. They both have an x in common. All right, so that means we can take out an x. The question is, do we take out an x squared or an x to the first power? And it's a little counterintuitive, but when it comes to exponents, we can only take the smallest of the numbers, so that'd be x to the first power. That gives us our GCF. Alright, so we're going to take this and I'm going to divide my binomial that's here on the left by that. Alright, you can see that I wrote 6x, or negative 6x, under each of the monomials in this binomial here. And I'm going to divide them out. Alright, and I'm not dividing for an answer. I'm dividing because I'm going to rewrite this binomial. So negative 12 divided by negative 6 gives me 2. X squared divided by x, I subtract the exponents and I get x to the first. And you notice here negative 6x over negative 6x, those are exactly the same thing, and according to the rules that we know, any number divided by itself is 1, so that's a positive 1. Now, that's not the answer. That's me factoring out negative 6x from the binomial. Now, remember, the opposite of dividing was multiplication, so that explains why I'm putting parentheses around it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that GCF that we found earlier right in front. And if you ask yourself, okay, why am I writing that way? That's the answer. It's negative 6x times 2x plus 1. And if I were to distribute this, like we've learned, that I would get the original binomial. Alright, so think of GCF as the opposite of the distributive property. So our final answer is negative 6x times 2x plus 1. Alright. So GCF, okay, is a method of factoring out binomials, trinomials, polynomials. Okay, and whenever we have the directions factor out, GCF is always the one that we always look to first. So I'm going to set it up like I did the last problem. You can see here this trinomial I have here, a squared, 5a, and ab. I separated that so you can get a better idea of what we're doing. All right, and I noticed that a squared, 5a, and ab, there is no constant or coefficient. Alright, and remember there's an invisible 1 here and an invisible 1 here. There's no number that I can divide 1, 5, and 1 other than 1. So I'm going to go ahead and ignore those numbers. Then I'm going to go back and look at our first base, or our first letter, or our first variable, and I notice that they all have a in common. So I'm going to look at the a, and then I notice I have a squared, I have a to the first, and a to the first. So that means that I can't take the square out. I got to take the exponent that's the lowest, that's a to the first. Then I notice that the third term here has a b, but none of the others. Remember, it says common, meaning that all three of these have to have something in common, and the first two monomials do not have a b. So we arrived at our GCF, and our GCF is just a. Like I did in the last problem, I'm going to take this GCF and place it under each of the monomials in this trinomial, and I'm going to divide out. Alright, so I'm going to go to the first term, a squared divided by a, subtract the exponents, and I get a to the first. 5a divided by a, that means that the a's cancel out, so I'm left with a positive 5. And then I go to the next one, ab divided by a, that cancels out and leaves me with a b. Alright, remember I divided, okay, and the opposite of dividing is multiplication. Okay, what did I divide by? The GCF, which is a, and I put it in the front. This is our final answer. How do I check if I'm right? Remember, we're going to do the opposite of dividing. We're going to go ahead and distribute. And if I said a times a, I get a squared. If I said a times 5, I get 5a. And if I said a times b, I got a b. And you can see that when I distribute, that they're the same. So there's your answer there. Alright, we have another trinomial. You can see 3x squared times bx plus 15cx squared times y plus 25 ad cubed y. That's a trinomial. I'm going to do what I did before to hopefully have you understand. You can see I separated the trinomial into monomials so we can look at it. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and look at the 3, the 15, and the 25, and then I ask myself, what can I divide or factor out? Now remember, it also says common, so all three of these numbers, 3, 15, and 25, need to be divisible. I know 3 can't go into 15 or 25, alright, so that automatically means that I cannot reduce or factor out anything between 3, 15, and 25. Next I go and I see that they have an A here and an A here, but the middle one doesn't have an A, so they don't all have an A in common. I go next thing, I go to B, and they don't all have a B, so I can go ahead and forget about B, and then X. Well, this one has an X, but the other one doesn't. And if you continue on with Y, you'll find out that the y is only common with the other two. Remember, this is greatest common factor. All three of these need to have something in common to GCF. So that means that there is nothing in common. And when there's nothing in common, you can't GCF. And if you can't GCF, the answer is prime. Alright, you can see our final example here in GCF. We have 12cd cubed minus 8c squared d squared plus 10d c to the fifth times d to the third. Alright, so we have 12, 8, and 10 in my trinomial. I separated them again, and then I'm going to ask myself, what can I divide 12, 8, and 10 by? What can I divide all of them by? I'm looking for the largest number. Alright. And the largest number is 2. Alright, I can't do 4, I can't do 6, I can't do 5. Alright, so that gives us our first number in our GCF. Then I notice that they all have they all have C in common. So I'm going to go ahead and put a C there. And then I'm going to compare my exponents, and I'm going to look for the smallest exponent, and that's C to the first. Then I notice that they all have D in common. So I'm going to go ahead and put D as part of my GCF, and then again I'm going to re-examine here, and I notice that there's a 3 exponent, a 2 exponent, and a 3. And I'm not taking the largest, I have to take the smallest, and that's squared. So that's our GCF. Now I'm going to go ahead and divide our trinomial out to start our method of GCFing. Alright, you can see I placed my GCF underneath the trinomial. I'm going to go ahead and use the process of division. Alright, so I'll just go 12 divided by 2 gives me 6. C divided by C cancels out. D to the third divided by D to the second. That means I bring the 2 up and it becomes subtraction, so I get D to the first. I'll go on to the next part of my trinomial, which is negative 8, and I'll divide that by 2, and that gives me a negative 4. You can see that c squared divided by c. That means I'm going to go ahead and bring that c up to the top, and the exponent will change to a negative, so I get c to the first power. And you notice that they're both d squared, and that cancels out. Then I'll go to the next monomial in this trinomial. That's 10 divided by 2, and that gives me a positive 5. C to the 5th divided by c. Well, that means I'm going to bring the 1 up in subtraction, so that gives me c to the 4th. And you can see that I have d to the 3rd divided by d squared. I'm just going to go ahead and subtract the exponents, and that means I bring the 2 up, it becomes a negative, so it gives me d to the 1st power. Alright, now remember we divided, alright, and we're not looking for an answer, we're just looking for the GCF. That means we're just rewriting this answer a little bit differently. Here's what happens when I divided, and what did we divide by? We divided by our GCF 2cd squared. So now think of this. We divided out 2cd squared. How do I put it back in? The opposite of division is multiplication. Our final answer.